As an attorney, I have to couch everything that what I'm providing is general legal information, not specific legal advice. I've been with the UAR for 9 years now, this month. And so when Curtis Bullock left the Utah Association of Realtors to become the CEO of the Salt Lake Board, I was his replacement. And when I first started, it was short sales and third-party approval and the short sale addendum, and now it's not, right? It's obviously a much different market. Just to kind of give you some perspective, I have an idea of the pulse of the market simply because of the hotline. Last week, I did a conservative estimate of the number of questions I answered, and it was conservatively 400 questions. We received approximately 150 callers, times it by 2 or 3, because each person has 2 or 3 real quick questions that they have on the hotline. And so I have an idea of what's going on. So my top 3 questions, or at least themes of questions, are this, and you guys are dealing with this, I'm sure, every day. Non-refundable earnest money, and how agents are drafting that language, and whether or not subsequent addenda modify non-refundable earnest money. So, for example, the FHA VA loan addendum. Well, which controls? Non-refundable earnest money or the FHA VA loan addendum? Well, I think the order of the addenda is going to matter. So if you have non-refundable earnest money, addendum number 1, but then you have the FHA VA loan addendum number 2, guess what's going to control? Number 2, which says that the buyer shall not lose their earnest money if the appraised value comes in less than the purchase price. And you have language within every single addendum that says if the terms of this addendum modify or conflict with previous offers, counter offers, or addenda, the terms of these addenda control. And I think with the FHA VA loan addendum, you have some confusing aspects with it. Even if you switch the order, so let's say you put FHA first, addendum number 1, and then non-refundable earnest money, attempting to modify the amendatory language in section 3 of the FHA VA loan addendum, you still have language within the FHA VA loan addendum that says that the buyer and seller agree to sign any lender required documentation. So think about that. What lender required documentation is required as part of an FHA VA loan? Well, it's going to be the same language, the same amendatory language. So even if buyer and seller agree that the earnest money is non-refundable, the lender may require buyer and seller to sign a mandatory language that says, again, that the buyer shall not lose their earnest money in the event of a low appraisal. Well, obviously, that lender required documentation is signed after the 2 parties have entered into a contract. So what I'm teaching right now is that, look, if you're going to have an FHA VA loan, no matter how you try to amend it, I think there's always going to be an argument that the earnest money is non-refundable in the event of a low appraisal. And I would just counsel your clients, both the buyer and the seller, to that point, so that they're not misled about what happens to the earnest money. Now, I get that buyers are going to try to give as much assurance as they can, but if they can't perform the day before settlement, I guarantee you they're going to be looking for a way to get their earnest money back, especially since the amounts of earnest money have gone up significantly over the last year. So non-refundable earnest money is absolutely something I'm seeing. Along that same line, the location of where it goes. So a lot of sellers have been told by their listing agent, look, it's non-refundable upon acceptance. Your seller gets that, within a couple of days of going under contract. And the answer is no. Non-refundable earnest money is simply changing the timing of when earnest money becomes non-refundable. It doesn't change the location of where it's being held. The default in the REPC is going to be the broker's trust account or the title company if you amend the REPC to do so.
What if they're saying the earnest money is part of acceptance? Does that mean that money has to be held at the time that it's accepted? Like it has to already be somewhere that it can be collected?
No, because unless you're modifying the very first section of the REPC, you still have 4 days upon acceptance to deliver the earnest money, and then you have 4 days in which to deposit the earnest money.
What if they cancel within 72 hours? The earnest money was never collected.
Never collected, but it still doesn't change that it was non-refundable.
So they would then have to perform by providing that check.
Yep, they would still have to give it to you, but at that point, the buyer may say, no, I canceled, I'm not going to give you earnest money. then would be the option of the seller to then pursue. And that's obviously not a fun proposition. But that would be the only way the seller could force the buyer to give up that earnest money.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So if I were to protect the sellers, could I say earnest money to be deposited within 24 hours of acceptance?
Sure.
So that you can move it up and make sure that you gain that it's been put into brokerage or title?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing sacred about the 4-day window. It's simply what the two parties have agreed to. There's nothing sacred about the location of where the earnest money goes. It's simply what the two parties have agreed to. So if the two parties want to modify that, absolutely, you're free to do so. My only word of caution would be when you're starting to modify boilerplate language of the REPC, make sure that the language is explicitly clear. I've had instances where buyer and seller, because of their agents, have drafted language. They both agree that the language says something, at least initially, but then when they go along 2-3 weeks later, their interpretations start to diverge. And you just want to be able to read the language today, 3 weeks from now, and have it be the same meaning. Because if you can interpret it more than one way, then your language is ambiguous. And that's where you personally are going to be liable for that language. Because you, frankly, have the broadest exception to the unauthorized practice of law. I've emphasized that in all my classes, that in the state of Utah, you have to be a licensed member of the bar in order to practice law in the state of Utah. But there are certain exceptions to that, and you fall under the broadest exception. You can fill in state-approved forms on behalf of your clients. One of the state-approved forms is the blank addendum, which means that you can draft contractual language, and you don't have to be a licensed member of the bar to do so. So it works. It cuts both ways. It gives you flexibility. It means you don't have to use an attorney for every transaction, but you're held to the standard of an attorney drafting that language. So you definitely want to run it past your broker if there's any creativity with that. So non-refundable earnest money. The second most frequently asked question that I've been asked, frankly, for the last 6 months is appraisal language, creative appraisal language that buyers are using. So, for example, in the event of a low appraisal, buyer agrees to pay $5,000 above the appraised value, period. Well, what happens when the appraisal comes in $50,000 less than the purchase price? Did that language modify the purchase price? In my opinion, I think there's some serious questions of whether or not it does. Because nothing in what I just said to you said anything about changing the purchase price, which is a defined term within the real estate purchase contract. I think if the two parties want a triggering event like a low appraisal to change the purchase price, then you have to be very explicit about it. You have to say, look, in the event of a low appraisal, buyer and seller mutually agree that the new purchase price shall be the appraised value plus $5,000. Now, if I'm a seller, I don't think I ever agree to that language, right? Unless there's some sort of floor. As a buyer, I probably would want to put a cap. I don't want the purchase price to increase above that in the case of a really good appraisal. So language like that, frankly, we've been somewhat hesitant to draft addenda just in response to what agents want because we want to analyze it very, very carefully. But the UAR did create an appraisal addendum. We want it to be very simple, so the purchase price does not change. We could have drafted it a number of ways, but all it does is make it clear, here's the purchase price, here's how low the buyer is willing to pay above the appraised floor. So for example, if the purchase price is $500,000 and I want to indicate that I'm happy to pay $20,000 above the appraised value, I would just put in an appraisal floor of $480,000. So if the appraisal came in below that, then the buyer still has a right to cancel based on the appraisal condition in 8.2 of the REPC. So that's a form that I've seen many sellers, at least as of late, use to counter some of the first language that I just brought up about buyers saying, oh, I'll pay $5,000 above appraised value. So that's the second most common question. The third, and frankly, there's not a whole lot I can do that's satisfactory in answering these questions, deals with new construction. You guys that are dealing with new construction, I had 3 calls on Monday with builders canceling contracts, with buyers that had already been under contract for 7-8 months, because they're pointing to a provision within their contract, and obviously I don't review that language, but they read to me the language that says something to the effect that the builder has a unilateral right to cancel the contract at any time, and here's the remedy for the buyer. Already spelled out, and more and more builders are doing that. I mean, you understand the market conditions as to why builders are doing that. Some a little more legitimate than others, right? But if that's a clause within the contract, it's going to be tough to overcome. I imagine there'll be some lawsuits depending on what the builders are countering, because a lot of builders are canceling and then saying, hey, we can go under contract again, but it'll be $150,000 more. Okay, well, there may be some litigation in the future over that, and I would imagine there will be. So, I'm just waiting for the test case on that. But that's all over the state, from Sandy. You guys have heard of places in Sandy, Eagle Mountain, St. George, and other places up north. I've heard of that happening. So those are the 3. Frankly, 40 to 50% of my calls are lumped into those three questions. Any specific questions you guys have for me?
I love it, Carrie's like, I'm like, I got it. Okay, so some of the questions that I have agents call are, they want to be able to give some of their buyer's commission back to the sellers. And so there's verbiage in there where they're saying the buyer's agent is going to contribute $1,000 towards the seller's closing costs. Typically the REPC typically doesn't discuss commissions, except for they just created the new addenda. Right? Those 2 different addendas. Can you speak on that and how they can navigate making their offers as strong as possible for their buyers?
Yeah, you guys have probably been taught for a number of years, never put commissions in the REPC. I think that was not a bad practice, but I think it was incomplete advice. So the idea of never putting commissions in the REPC, really what the impetus behind that was never try to modify the BAC within the REPC. That's really what instructors should have been saying. And that makes sense, right? Because a contract in the REPC is between the buyer and the seller. The BAC is a different contract, right? It's between the listing brokerage and the buyer's brokerage. So even if the 2 parties wanted to change the BAC in the REPC, there's no place for you or the other side to sign the real estate purchase contract. So let's say buyer and seller said, yeah, let's change the BAC to 0. Let's cut the agents out. Well, that's not going to be legally effective because you're not signing the REPC. So that's really what people mean in what they're saying. Don't put commissions in the real estate purchase contract. Don't try to change the BAC or change a contract between the buyer's brokerage and the listing brokerage. But commissions can go in the REPC. And here's how you could appropriately do so. If the buyer asks the seller, for example, hey, I would like you, seller, to pay X number of dollars to my buyer's brokerage. Well, that's the buyer asking the seller to pay a third-party cost. That happens all the time, right? Buyer asks the seller, will you pay my closing costs? Okay, that's a buyer responsibility. If seller is willing to pay that buyer responsibility, perfectly fine. That's between 2 contracting parties. Now, you're right. In this market, it's kind of being flipped on its head a little bit, right? Completely. Now buyers are saying, hey, I am willing to pay your third-party cost, seller. Okay, great. That's perfectly fine. I can think of a number of reasons why a buyer would do that. One, obviously, it nets the seller more. That's probably the primary reason. But there could be other reasons why a buyer would say, look, I'll pay your listing brokerage commission. Well, that's not going to be included in the purchase price. So I can think maybe for tax purposes, why a buyer would want their property taxes to maybe be less if it's a high-end property, where they say, look, our purchase price is, let's just say, $1 million, but I will pay your listing brokerage fee of just for easy math, $100,000. I mean, that's a lot, but $100,000. Well, the purchase price is still just going to be $1 million. But the net to the seller is going to be the same as it was if it were 110. 100. Yeah, 1 million. I'm not very good. 1.1. There you go. That's what I was going for. 1.1 million. So that could be a reason why a buyer could have some incentive to doing so. But the main purpose is to get their offer accepted so that the seller nets as much as possible. So that's where it would be permissible in the purchase contract.
Okay, so let's just talk about buyer's letters in the Fair Housing Act. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so kind of pick me letters or love me letters. They're not illegal. I mean, that's probably the one spot I can start with. So it's not illegal for a buyer to include that as part of their offer, right? I mean, they can describe any reason why they want to buy the property, and that may be divulging, protected classes. Where it does become a potential issue, which is evolving. I mean, there's nothing that I'm aware of in Utah where this has been litigated, so it's more just kind of speculation, best practices. So for example, if a seller reads this letter and it divulges familial status, religion, ethnicity, and because of those reasons, the seller now chooses this buyer over another, that's where it becomes problematic. And in this market, I've seen some sellers, I had a hotline call where a seller had narrowed down their, they had 30 offers, they narrowed down their 30 to their top 3, and they specifically told these top 3 buyers, hey, you're in our top 3. We want you to write a letter explaining why we should choose you. Okay, that's going to be problematic. Why? Because now the seller is indicating to these 3 buyers, we are now going to base our decision on the contents of the letter that you are sending to us. And probably that letter is going to be accompanied by a picture or a photo, right? That's something I would caution my sellers against. I know that there's a lot of emotion in selling property, and sometimes sellers feel like they need to, they love their neighbors, or they want to have a certain type of person come into their property. No, you just need to counsel them that, look, the Fair Housing Act and all of these protected classes now apply to you. You can be held in violation of this. And so really educate them of the basis of their decision making really should be based on dollars and cents. Any sort of consideration of protected class statuses, that's where not only the real estate brokers could get into trouble, but certainly the seller could as well.
When you have a listing and you put on there no buyer's letters to be given to sellers, are you breaking anything, or is there any language that should be put or not put?
I would just have that dialogue with my seller, and then if your seller authorizes you to put that in there, great. And frankly, that may be a good way to narrow down buyers that just disregard that language. Because I've seen some sellers say, look, if they can't follow simple instructions, then I'm not even going to consider their offer. Which, makes sense.
Okay. But if the listing agent does not put that in there and you send over a letter, are they obligated to share that?
I would say you need to let your seller know that this was part of the offer and to ask the seller what they want to do with that. So if you don't have express authorization to separate a letter from an offer, or to give specific instructions to buyers, don't send in a letter, then I'd say anytime you receive an offer and it has a cover letter, you would still need to give that to your seller.
But if they approve that, okay, I don't want to see them,
then you're authorized at that point, and that would be lawful instructions from the seller.
Do we have to have that in writing from our sellers?
You don't have to, but from an evidentiary standpoint, it would be ideal to have something in writing. And that could be an addendum to the listing agreement. That could be an email or a text message. Anything to show that you're obeying lawful instructions from your seller. Now, verbal works, but oftentimes people have different, recollections of what conversations are. Yeah.
Very good.
So pretty much like the buyer's letters, they're more of a liability for sellers than they are actually for the buyers.
Yes. Yep. That's exactly right. Exactly right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So I guess there's there's not a whole lot of downside for a buyer, I guess. Unless the seller has said, don't give me the letter, and you still give them a letter, then you may not make the seller happy.
Right.
Let's talk about advertising sold price. We are a non-disclosure state, and so when we are, here's the confusion I have with the conversation with an agent. A CMA discloses sold price. What is the difference between marketing sold price and a CMA?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in the course of action. So you're authorized by the MLS to use sold data, and it is for obtaining a listing on a kind of a one-on-one scenario. But broad dissemination of sold data, I would say you need authorization from your client to do so. So if you represent a seller and they're incredibly happy with you, and they say, look, we're okay if you disseminate that information in your marketing going forward, great, you have authorization, you can do that, and that'd be fine. You would just need to amend your listing agreement to add that authorization. Right now, the listing agreement only gives authorization for you to turn that sold data over to the MLS. And that's what the clients authorize you to. If you want broader authorization, perfect. There's nothing, non-disclosure status doesn't change that. It just means that it's not disclosed to a government entity at the point of sale. I mean, that's all non-disclosure is. And there's 11 states left in the US that are non-disclosure.
We also see a lot right now with sellers wanting a lease back, free, 2 months, 60 days. I want to just sit in my house.
No deposit.
No deposit, no security deposit,
Sure.
nothing. Tell us what that looks like with on your side.
Well, it's happening. That's a legitimate question. And one, we are modifying the short-term leaseback agreement.
Okay.
We're making changes to that because it works, but it doesn't work. It works because it's simple. It's a one-page form, but it's a lease agreement. I think sometimes we lose that perspective that you are now a landlord and the seller is now a tenant. I mean, it just is. And so, ideas of insurance and damage to the property and rent and what happens if the seller doesn't move out, what do we do in those situations? So if you have zero rent, zero security deposit, there's not a whole lot of upside for the buyer. And I get to get into a property or to get your offer accepted, that's what you have to do. But I would just advise your buyer that there are some risks here. The biggest risks that I've heard of are, look, if the seller's trying to build and trying to time that and saying, look, I'm going to build and hopefully move into my new build in 60 days, okay, there's a risk. I mean, I just talked about new construction. I mean, not only are builders canceling contracts, but they're also delaying substantial completion. So that's a big deal. So what happens if the seller just doesn't move out? Well, what does the buyer have to do at that point? They have to give notice. They have to go through the eviction process. And our eviction laws are very landlord friendly. So it does triple the damages of what a landlord incurs, which includes lost rent and attorney's fees. But 3 times 0 is what? Zero, right? So I mean, putting nothing in there, I mean, I'd probably, I'm kind of spitballing a little bit, but I'd probably say rent is going to be X number of dollars, buyer and seller agree to waive rent or something, but it will be due if seller doesn't, vacate. And then that way, I have at least some teeth there that says, look, rent is going to be $2,000 a month. I'm waiving it, so I'm waiving that $4,000 if it's 2 months, but I now can collect it if you fail to move out. And then that way, 3 times 4,000 is a much more substantial amount of money, plus attorney's fees and court costs. So there are some remedies, and we're trying to tweak the short-term leaseback agreement to make it more of a lease. So it's not going to be a 1-page, it's probably going to be closer to a 3-page document. And I get it, if we make it too legally complex, then sellers might say, no, I'm not signing that. And they have a lot of leverage, and they may say, look, I just want in the rep C to say 60 days after recording, and I don't want a lease. Okay, well, there's some risk with that. I mean, I would just let your buyers know that there's some downfalls. I get the calls where sellers just don't move out. And that's happening, right? Because they can't find a place, or again, new construction is delayed or canceled.
That just is scary.
Yeah.
Well, especially during COVID and protection and all the rest of that nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, you could have the moratorium where that could apply. I think there could be some attacks to that, and frankly, there was a challenge where it was deemed unconstitutional just recently, the moratorium, but I mean, it's now a year into it, so it's kind of maybe a little too late for that, but yes, there are some of those considerations. Good
Well,
point.
that is a good solution that you just mentioned as far as getting the offer accepted and just putting in writing X amount of dollars per month waived and less da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good approach and still not
Yeah.
losing every single offer you write.
Yeah, and hopefully the seller is agreeable to something. I mean, it's all under the caveat that I give that's kind of ivory tower, like, oh, you could do this, and I'm not a practitioner, so I don't know if a seller's gonna balk at that and say, no, I'll accept an offer that will just put 0.
Right, and
I get it. I mean, I just I'm risk averse just from my legal background, and so if you can get that in there, I think it's advantageous for your buyer.
and that's what I'm stating, that's one of the solutions that I believe we could apply.
I hope so.
Where some of the other ones not so much, but this one I think absolutely wouldn't deter the offer.
Right, because most sellers are saying, I'm not going to pay any rent.
Right.
Security deposit? Why would I do that? I can accept 3 other offers that aren't going to do that.
Exactly.
So how is there, okay, so I'm a little confused. On the Rep C, how is there more risk by saying, you're gonna take possession, at time of settlement, or 24 hours after, or 60 days after?
Why is that more
Why-
of a risk?
Right,
Because they're
because
staying in
you're
the home.
you're still in the Rep C, it's saying you will leave, so there would be the same risk that they're not gonna leave the day that they're supposed to when you close, or
Sure.
24 hours later, or 60 days later. How
Sure.
is that how does that change your risk?
Well, a lease agreement's going to spell out exactly what obligations and dividing who's responsible for what. And very often in a lease agreement, it outlines what constitutes a default. It outlines penalties. So if you just waive all of that and just go off of a number of, hey, you're going to deliver possession 60 days upon recording, you now lose all of those other stipulations. So you lose insurance, you lose condition. Well, not necessarily condition. You lose some remedies if the seller doesn't move out. Because if the seller doesn't move out and there's no lease agreement, then again, 3 times 0 is 0.
Right.
And so collecting on any sort of damages after that may be a little more difficult. Because then you're only relying upon the remedies of the Rep C. Well, the Rep C talks about, default scenarios. Well, you've already closed on the property. So, suing for a sum equal to the earnest money, that's not going to be appropriate. Suing for specific performance, that's not going to be appropriate. Any other remedies available under the law, maybe you can prove your damages, but again, that's going to be, you close. So it's kind of, you may be barred from any sort of judgment against the seller. And that's kind of what I'm highlighting there.
So you're saying if you have selected on the Rep C 60-day possession,
Right.
and you do not have a lease back
No
to
lease.
cover that 60 days, you're leaving your buyers at risk because they're now going to take 2 months for the sellers to get out. What if the sellers move out and then there's a huge burn on the hardwood floor and there's no recourse for your buyers?
Sure.
Because there was no lease in place. Is that correct? Am I understanding
I
that right?
think in that, the condition of the property is a little different because I think you still have section 10.3 of the Rep C that talks about how the buyer will deliver the property in substantially the same general condition as it was upon acceptance, in room clean condition, free of debris and personal belongings. So-
However, though, the sellers are still in it, so you don't get to do a buyer's walkthrough when there's a later possession date.
You do get to do a final walkthrough, but you're right, it's somewhat,
Like they don't.
it's not very
furniture,
helpful.
right?
Yeah, it's not very helpful because it's 7 days, it's no later than 7 days prior to settlement. So you still get a chance to do a walkthrough, but you're right, if possession's gonna be another 60 days after that, then it's problematic. And the short-term lease back agreement does allow for a walkthrough of the property to note the condition and what's being delivered there. Yeah.
So from a lender perspective, as a primary residence, you have to enter the property within 60 days, or you have 60 days. So could you get the lender to help you, like, let's say day 65, for example? Like, if they're not, because I mean, now it's not a primary residence based on what you signed at closing, because you have 60 days to enter the property. So is there any recourse or help that could you reach? I mean, I don't think a servicer, because for example, I'm First Colony, we sell the mortgage. Let's say, who the hell knows?
Right.
I don't know that they'll help you, but technically you're in default of what you signed 65 days ago.
Sure.
So that's always a concern with me when agents, when they come to me and we do lease back and stuff, I always have to remind them, make sure it's no more, we even have to put a date on there sometimes.
Sure.
Or an underwriter will ask us, hey, put the 7th, not through the end of the month.
Yeah.
One day.
To be frank, I don't think the lender's going to do anything to help you with getting the seller out of the property.
Yeah, I don't do
But I don't think it's necessarily in violation of what you signed. I mean, if a seller decides to stay over and you have to go through the eviction process, I mean, that's not you being complicit in extending the lease term.
Yeah,
So I don't think that would have any sort of bearing on,
because it's intent.
yeah, the lender saying, look, we're now going to exercise our due on sell clause and we think this is mortgage fraud. No, I don't think that's going to happen at all. I think it's going to be, when you sign that, you were intending on occupying the property as your primary residence within 60 days, which I've heard has been extended to 90 days, but that's neither here nor there. It's really your declaration of, this is my intent to occupy, and unless a life circumstance changes, like change of job or location, or in this case, the seller refusing to move, I mean, that's out of your control.
I was just thinking of ways to help the buyer. Like
Sure.
Because a buyer, I can see a buyer calling me like tomorrow.
A buyer, yeah, sure. A buyer calls and says, hey, how do I get them out? And I think your best advice at that point is, okay, you need to talk to an attorney about sending a notice and going through the eviction
My
process.
advice would not be to contact the lender.
Yeah, the lender's not going to be able to help you with that.
That seems to be, how do you enforce anything?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of ways.
Like, I'm thinking, for example, like I have a contract right now where the earnest money went hard upon acceptance, right? But there's the 4 calendar days in the Rep C
Sure.
that they have to get in there. So should the addendum take precedent over
Agree.
what's in the Rep C? But
Yeah.
you can't enforce that, how do you make them?
Right. I mean, you're right. The contract is only as good as both parties honoring it. Right? I mean, that's with anything. I mean, that's been it for years, right? It's, if a buyer passes all their deadlines, fails to perform, and just says, look, I want the earnest money, the only recourse for a seller to force the buyer to get that money would be through litigation, and which is oftentimes, small claims. So you're right. I mean, but the contract is meant not just to be a mechanism as far as, hey, I'm going to hit you over with a stick. It's meant to be, here is what happens if one party fails to live up to their contractual obligations. So it's meant to spell out kind of the roadmap for either the buyer or the seller as to what are my avenues at this point. And you're right, it's not satisfactory for me to say, well, sue them. I don't like saying that. I mean, I'm an attorney. I mean, that doesn't sound satisfactory. I mean, it's cumbersome, it's costly, but that's what the roadmap says. And there is kind of a carrot or a carrot at the end of the stick when we talk about Section 17 talks about attorney's fees being awarded to the prevailing party. So that's where we've put that section in there to encourage mediation, not necessarily to encourage litigation, even though it's a mechanism built in to compensate attorneys. It's meant to say, look, if you really want to go to litigation, seller, when you've defaulted, great, I'll go down that road, but you're now going to have to pay for your attorney's fees, and you're going to have to pay for my attorney's fees, which isn't, again, not the most satisfactory answer, but it's at least something that you can point to.
So like in one of my addendums, I put earnest money goes hard 24 hours after acceptance and guaranteed. But I didn't mess with the boilerplate saying how many days that it goes to
When
get
is it
into the
collected?
account.
Sure.
I didn't mess with that, so that
Sure.
didn't have anything to do with it, so I don't have to worry about the 4 days.
Yeah, so if you say earnest money is going to be non-refundable 24 hours after acceptance, then in my mind, that language only changes the refundability of the earnest money.
Yeah, and
I
I
don't-
didn't state when it was gonna be in the,
So if you didn't state when it needs to be delivered or when it needs to be deposited, then it just reverts to what it does say, which is the 4 days and then the 4 days.
So if you're on this listing site and you wanna protect your sellers and you get that offer that says upon 24 hours after acceptance, earnest money's hard, you would want to counter offer and say earnest money to be deposited within 24 hours of acceptance.
yeah.
So that you have the money to be able to hold on to, is that correct?
Yeah, and you could even counter saying, and to be held with
Yeah. Of
wise choice. I mean, you can hold earnest money with a listing brokerage.
We don't like to, but. we
I mean, you can't. I have obviously
Yeah.
checked with your broker. Again, there's nothing illegal about the location. It just needs to spell it out in the contract.
So I have another question. So when in the Rec C, there's the part where it says may or shall for litigation, basically. Like, when would you use either? Like, that's what I've never really understood.
Sure. For me, and talk to your broker about what he should check, I would always check may.
Okay.
Not because I don't love mediation. I think mediation, you should go to mediation. But I check may because that just leaves me additional options. If two parties are having a dispute and they want to mediate, may allows the two parties to still do so. But if two parties are completely adversarial and there's no chance mediation is going to work, and you want to bypass mediation and go straight to litigation if possible, then may allows for that. Shall, I mean, then you have to show that you attempted to mediate, you have to go through the cost and expense of going through that, and frankly, again, I'd want to be able to gauge the situation before being forced to go through mediation, because I know it's not going to be fruitful, and it's just a means to go to litigation. So, again, I would check may, but still encourage mediation, is probably the way that I would couch that. Good question.
I want to jump from back to lease. So we have lease back that's very popular right now, but in some instances, people are still going to use the option for purchase.
Oh, are
You
you
know,
still seeing that?
pretty rare, but we are.
Okay.
Can you speak about that just, and kind of the money that goes along with that?
Yeah, so the lease with an option to purchase, where I think some agents get confused. They think, oh, that's a lease agreement, and then we'll sign a rep C down the road. No, that's a purchase contract too, right? It's a lease and it's a purchase contract, but it's also an option contract. And frankly, it's one form we're looking at revising as well. It hasn't been revised for a while. As far as priorities, it's maybe a little bit lower just because most sellers are saying, look, I would only enter into a lease with an option to purchase if, it was more of a buyer's market or something like that. So right now, I'm not seeing as many leases with an option to purchase, but it has option money, which is non-refundable. So it's option money that the seller gets to keep. It's applied toward the purchase price. If the buyer exercises the notice of intent to purchase, but it's a complicated form. I mean, I'll just be frank with you. It's something that if you're unfamiliar with, I would definitely bring in someone that's done a lease with an option to purchase at least once or twice, so that you're familiar with it, that you can best advise your client about it, because it's a lease agreement. And it talks about tenant responsibilities and what happens if the tenant defaults, and we're going to address some other things in that lease, but it's a creative way to allow a purchase to happen, but most options get exercised, I would imagine, but it's a lengthy process. I mean, there's questions about when commissions are due. I mean, it's frankly, it predates my time at the UAR, let's just say that.
It's been around for a while,
Yeah.
I have a question on that actually.
Okay.
So if you actually did have like a lease with an option of purchase and you already had the rental agreement, they your buyers or whatever paid the rent for it, but they they closed on the home before the rent was supposed to be up, which is mentioned. Okay, it talks about prorating the remainder of that, that month for the rent that had already been paid. How would you even collect that, especially because it's just rent, so it doesn't go through title? So how would your buyers then go and collect that remaining prorated amount?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a seller obligation, so they would have to, you know, depending on when you settle, it would be a seller to say, look, I know you've paid for this month's rent already, but we're now gonna settle and close on X number of days, so it would be a seller, in essence, refunding back to the buyer.
What if they didn't do that at closing then?
Well, then it would be up to the buyer to go after the seller for
Okay.
those prorations, which isn't, again, satisfactory, but that's,
Yeah.
that's their only option at that
Yeah.
point.
Okay, I think we asked for an hour of your time, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we got 10 minutes. I have 2 questions left. Anybody else? Okay,
Okay.
let's talk about earnest money being held at title versus brokerage.
Okay.
We have agents that feel one has more power over the other. We have agents that feel they all have to follow the same documentations. Will you please speak on that?
Yeah, I don't think I have any sort of strong feelings one way or the other. I can see why brokers would want to use a title company just from a liability standpoint. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. I know that there's been talk with the Division of Real Estate of potentially updating the addendum that changes the location of earnest money to maybe giving some instructions to a title company to say, look, and you can, buyer and seller mutually agree that this authorizes the title company to release earnest monies in accordance with the real estate purchase contract. And I think that's the biggest concern agents and frankly their clients have about earnest money being held with the title company, right? Is, well, will the title company release funds if I cancel based on due diligence? When it's clear, it says what happens to the earnest money. Buyer gets it, no further written authorization from the seller, but what if the seller just doesn't sign what the title company is requiring them to sign? And I think that happens very rarely. I get the calls where it does happen, where the seller just says, no, you took my property off the market for X number of days, I'm not making it easy for you. Then the title company has to interplead the funds and they subtract a dollar amount from that, and it doesn't serve the clients very well when it becomes adversarial like that. Whereas earnest money being held with a broker's trust account, there is some latitude and flexibility for a principal broker. Under the admin rules, a principal broker can release the funds even over the objection of one of the other parties if the principal broker can point to a provision within the REPC that authorizes disbursement.
And title cannot do that.
I think title can, but I don't think they do.
Okay.
They're uber conservative, and frankly, if I were a principal broker and there was kind of this gray area, I would hold on to the funds. I would treat it almost like how a title company does. Just from a brokerage liability standpoint, I'd say, look, both parties are wanting these funds. I'd say, look, sign a document that authorizes where it needs to be dispersed, or small claims telling me where it needs to go. I mean, that's
Yeah.
realistically the two options there. So did you have a question back here?
Yeah, so with FHA buyers, I seen on agent remarks, if you have a FHA buyer and the appraisal asks for repairs, your buyers are supposed to fix their own or do the repairs and
Oh,
stuff,
yeah.
so.
Interesting.
So to me, it's like, yikes, that's a lot of risk for my buyers and buyers to do that, cause what if they are requesting a whole bunch of stuff, replace the roof, windows and all.
Right,
You
right,
really don't wanna put them in that position, right?
right. And now it's adding value to the seller's property, and
You're
yeah,
working- or you're paying for an invoice that's not even your property.
right.
How's that gonna work?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had somebody tell me, well, my clients are just lazy, they don't wanna do anything, so if you really wanna, so I said, well, I really don't wanna, look and take that risk, I told it, and yeah, we don't wanna risk it, we're just keep
Sure.
working.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly
And as a
right.
listing agent, I really, what we do, we make sure, it goes FHA as well, and I really don't wanna put anybody in that position as well.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's just the market forces where seller has a ton of leverage, and if they can ask for those types of provisions, super risky to a buyer. But if the buyer and seller mutually agree to that,
Yeah.
then there's nothing illegal about it.
Okay. Just wanted to-
Good point, though. That's fascinating. Man, that leverage of negotiating it's
Oh, a
entirely.
lot of people are putting the zeros on the FHAs.
Sure, sure.
All the way down.
I mean, I had a lender call me saying, hey, why are sellers discriminating against veterans or discriminating against first home buyers? You know, it won't go FHA or VA. They're saying they won't accept an FHA. I said, look, they're not discriminating against them. The only reason they're not accepting their offers is because of the amendatory language in Section 3. That's it. I think buyers would love to, or sellers would love to sell to a veteran or a first-time home buyer at a better rate. I mean, I think they would love that. But because of that language, that's part of the amendatory language, that's not only in the FHA VA loan addendum, but also in the lender required documentation. I mean, that's why sellers aren't accepting those offers.
I ran into this new auction thing they're doing with real estate now. They're doing auction things where they'll list it and run it through auction. And one of the listings I seen, it said two things. First, they couldn't do anything with transparency, obviously, because it was doing auction price. But one, it said you have to use an agent.
Interesting. I haven't seen those or had any questions about that, but so requiring a buyer to have a real estate agent in order to place a bid. Yeah, I don't know what would be illegal about that,
Okay.
or the inverse,
Yeah.
right? Saying you can't have an agent. I mean, I've had those types of calls. Not per se saying you can't use an agent, but like a builder saying, look, here's the price if you use an agent, here's the price if you don't.
That wouldn't be
But
like
can they
considered steering?
say you can't buy this if you don't use an agent?
No, they're not saying that per se, but they're just quoting in essence two prices, saying the commissions are built into the purchase price.
No, they're saying you can't buy it if you don't.
If you're not represented
If
by
you're not
an agent.
represented by an agent,
Sure.
you have to be represented by the bank.
Yeah, I don't know what would be legal about that stipulation. Because it's not a protected class,
Okay.
right? So saying that you have to have a real estate agent in order to place a bid on this property, I mean, you're gonna now filter out some buyers.
If it's a broker,
If it's a broker,
Yeah, 'cause
it would depend on whether or not it's coming from the seller. If it's a broker saying, absolutely, we won't show any offers unless it's written by an agent, but the seller hasn't given that authorization, then that's impermissible. I mean, that's gonna be a breach of the code of ethics, it's gonna be a breach of state law, licensing law. But it's a huge depends on whether or not it's authorized by the seller, in my mind.
I saw something similar, and it wasn't a new build or anything like that, but it was listed a while ago, and the broker, and we had contacted the broker about it too, but he had said that they wouldn't look at, consider, or accept any offers that didn't come with a pre-approval from the specific lender.
Preferred lender.
Yeah, but it wasn't a new build or anything like that. So they wouldn't even consider it. So wouldn't that be some type of steering?
On an existing home.
If
Yeah.
they were requiring you to use that lender, then yeah, potentially there's some implications there.
And
but
that was their loophole. They're well, we're not requiring you to use the lender, but you have to be pre-approved by that specific lender. And I'm well, that really sucks if your buyers already had their credit pulled,
right.
and now you have to go through this whole thing. And of course, then they gave you 3 days to actually submit it. So you had 3 days to get pre-approved and all of that with their lender.
I understand the concern, but that would be legal. Just for the very reasons like a new construction, I don't see it as any different as to why maybe a builder or a seller could do that.
And my last question is
Yeah, they all do.
co-listing a listing, but you have your best friend in a different brokerage than me, but we really want to list this property together.
Oh, okay. So co-listing arrangements are legal in Utah. I know some brokerages that say, look, we'll never do a co-listing. I've talked to some brokerages and they say, no, we'll never do a co-listing. We'd rather just refer it out before doing a co-listing. So one, you certainly have to talk to your broker about whether or not your brokerage authorizes co-listings, but really the only way, it's really simple. All you would have to do is just get an agency agreement, so the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, and an addendum to that just adds another brokerage to being able to represent the seller. That's really all you would have to do, and so the seller would have to sign off, and the two brokerages would have to sign off that now the seller is being represented by two brokerages. And then certainly the brokerages would have to coordinate how they're gonna market the property and things like that, but frankly, you could put both brokerages on your advertising materials. I've talked to the division, they said, look, you could just put one on there. I mean, you just need to make sure that the phone numbers match up with the correct brokers, so you couldn't put one phone number that goes to a different brokers but not have their name. I mean, I try to think of wacky scenarios, but as long as you have the name of the brokerage on your advertising and you have if you have a contact information, it's to an agent that's within that brokerage, perfectly fine.
So you would have, one brokerage, you would have to have both brokerages on the flyer, let's say?
No, you could, but you wouldn't have to.
It would be one or the other,
Yeah.
but it just has to be on an addendum and all parties and brokers have to sign off.
Yep, just an addendum to the exclusive right to sell. Yep.
Okay. That's
Sounds like a
better
big
answer than
headache.
I had before.
Yeah.
On like he was mentioning on the bidding platform, if there's something that says that the seller reserves the right to accept, counter, or reject any bid, let's say that the winning bid didn't offer as many concessions, perks than another bid that wasn't the winning bid.
Sure.
But then the winning bid can they say, well, I am higher, so I'm going to sue because you are not taking me and you are going with another one.
I mean, it would depend on how it's written, but if there's language that reserves the right to the seller to counter or to move forward or accept any offer that they want, then yeah, I think there'd be very little liability for the seller, even if they chose a lower bid. But
Yeah.
I think it depends on how the auction's being set up.
Okay.
Is really kind of what it boils down
Because
to.
well, in here, if he says any bid, that will imply even the winning, right? Because it's any.
Oh sure, yeah, any would be a mall.
Okay.
I have one more question. This is, I don't know if it's in or off the topic, but for example, I'm gonna go door knocking this weekend, and because of COVID and stuff, is there any liabilities that I may be taking with me, with my just sold listings, trying to get more leads?
No, as far as
Marketing, like.
COVID, no, I don't know of any. I mean, there's no restrictions in doing that as far as statewide or federal restrictions. I'm trying to think local county, like Salt Lake County, if there's any restrictions on door to door. Not that I'm aware of. So I think that would be permissible.
And then when it says no soliciting, what are your thoughts on that? Can I steal a door knock?
No soliciting.
I'm not soliciting, I'm just providing information.
You're not selling your services. You're not
I'm just dropping by.
spoken like a true salesman.
Yeah, what if it's an open house, you know, when you have the open
You're just
house?
inviting them to an open house and not soliciting anything to happen.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Good luck. I mean, yeah.
Good luck.
My guess is.
Thanks.
I'm just saying. My guess is they put that sign on there for a reason, and if you knock on the door, even if it's to invite them to an open house, I'm not sure how receptive they're gonna be. I mean,
Yeah.
you can sure you're welcome to knock on that, and you just may want to check the local municipal code on how they define what solicitation is. If it's any sort of selling, most codes are going to say that's in violation of that. But yeah, if you're not selling anything, then maybe you fall under this isn't solicitation per se. But most people might
market
not.
analysis.
Well, if your flyer
Yeah.
says one thing, and then you're telling them that you're inviting them, and then you're not, you're saying two different things.
No, if I go as like, hey, I'm providing you a free market update for sure. I just sold the house.
You just want to tell them about it. You're excited about it. I'm excited about it. I sold your neighbor's house. Yeah.
And I just spoke to an attorney, just yesterday,
I just wanted to tell you that. I'm sure they'll sign up right there. Yeah. your goal isn't just to tell them that you sold the house, right? You ultimately want them to sign up with you.
Yeah.
So I think the question is, yeah, would that be effective? I mean, what's the efficacy there?
And then COVID, and they didn't wanna break in.
Yeah.
Somebody might try to say, hey, we got COVID because of you now.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, wear a mask.
you can wear a mask or
Wear a
have a
glove.
pan unvaccinated, whatever you want to do.
A helmet.
Do a number.
We
Okay.
appreciate